Hello, and thanks for joining me. Remember the atheist professor's brain? That old chain email where the Christian student says, if we can't see God, then he doesn't exist? Well, since we can't see the atheist professor's brain, I declare that the atheist professor has no brain. And all the students laugh, and it's a great time. Remember that? By the way, if I ever go into teaching, I'm going to keep a CAT scan of my brain handy for just this purpose. Anyway, this email also introduced a theodicy, or an attempt to excuse God's permitting evil in the world. It says that evil is merely the absence of good, or of God. So according to this fictional student, when a 5-year-old girl is beaten, raped, and strangled to death, it's her fault for not having God in her heart. Or something. It's never been made clear to me how this is supposed to excuse God for anything. Certainly if the atheist professor had been there, he would have intervened and saved the girl. Is God less good than the atheist professor? This video is the third in my series on the argument from evil. In the first video in this series, I presented the argument itself. In the second video, I presented the most common response to the argument, the free will theodicy. In this video, I'll be presenting other theodicies, or attempts to present a good which morally justifies God in permitting evil in the world, and I'll be showing why they are not persuasive in rescuing God from the argument from evil. I'm going to start by recapping the argument itself. The version of the argument that I use is essentially the version put forth by William Rowe in the 1980s. In order to clarify the issues involved, it doesn't refer to all evil in the world, but to two specific cases of evil, which we'll call E1 and E2. E1 is, lightning strikes a tree in a forest, causing a forest fire, in which a fawn is caught and perishes after suffering intense agony. E2 is, a 5-year-old girl is, by her mother's boyfriend, severely beaten, raped, and strangled to death. The argument is, premise P, no good state of affairs that we know of is such that God, by bringing it about, is justified in permitting E1 and E2. Therefore, premise Q, it is likely that no good state of affairs, period, is such that God, by bringing it about, is justified in permitting E1 and E2. Therefore, conclusion, it is likely that God does not exist. This is an evidential argument, not a logical argument, so we're not establishing the non-existence of God with mathematical certainty, but only that the evidence makes the non-existence of God quite likely. After the free will theodicy, the soul-making theodicy is probably the most popular response to premise P, although it has fallen somewhat out of favor in recent decades for reasons I'll go into. It states that there is a good state of affairs that justifies God's permitting E1 and E2, and that this state of affairs is sustaining an environment of moral and spiritual growth. John Hick, the most well-known proponent of the soul-making theodicy, puts it like this. To most parents, it seems more important to try to foster quality and strength of character in their children than to fill their lives at all times with the utmost degree of pleasure. If then there is any true analogy between God's purpose for his human creatures and the purpose of loving and wise parents for their children, we have to recognize that the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain cannot be the supreme and overriding end for which the world exists. Rather, this world must be a place of soul-making, and its value is to be judged not primarily by the quantity of pleasure and pain occurring in it at any given moment, but by its fitness for its primary purpose, the purpose of soul-making. First of all, I think we can question this theodicy's assumption that quality and strength of character, as we presently conceive of it, is, in a cosmic sense, desirable. Either that, or we can accuse the soul-making theodicy of circular reasoning. Because if not for moral and natural evils, there would be no need for such positive character traits as, say, courage.
What makes the Sphinx the seventh wonder? Courage. What makes the dawn come up like thunder?
What makes courage desirable? What makes it a positive character trait? The fact that it lessens suffering, say, by inspiring someone to rush into the forest and rescue the fawn. But why is it necessary to lessen suffering? Because God allows so much of it. So we seem to have a problem right off the bat. These character traits only seem to be desirable given a world with gratuitous suffering, but the necessity of such a world is exactly what is at issue. Another immediate problem with this theodicy is that it takes an all-or-nothing approach. Surely a world with little or no moral or natural evil doesn't have to become a hedonistic paradise. At least we've been given no reason to believe that that would necessarily be the case. Posit a world which is conducive to soul-making, to moral and spiritual growth, but in which E1 was not permitted to take place. Why is such a world less valuable than the world we have today? More broadly speaking, even if we grant that permitting moral evil is justified in the name of soul-making, why is this true for natural evil? Perhaps some natural evils can be attributed to moral actions, such as climate change, but surely no humans are responsible for lightning, earthquakes, or gamma-ray bursts. Nick Trukakis, in The God Beyond Belief, posits a world just like ours except without natural evils, only moral evils, so the only natural evils that could occur would be human-caused. He does know that the law of predation and evolution by natural selection could not happen in such a world, but even so, clearly this world, which he calls, perhaps with a bit of irony, Eden, would be a far cry from the hedonistic paradise that Hick rails against. Richard Swinburne complains that such a world would be too soft, too cushy for proper soul-making. But Swinburne hasn't really thought it through. Just like Earth, Eden would have a multitude of races, creeds, cultures, etc. There could still be plenty of greed and corruption and racism and so forth. If, God likes that kind of thing. Just because we have a more regulated natural system doesn't prevent us from polluting the environment or building oppressive regimes. There would be plenty of room for moral evils and therefore for soul-making in this world. So the soul-making theodicy does not explain why natural evils, such as E1, are permitted to occur. There's one more problem with the soul-making theodicy, and it's actually a problem that arises with every theodicy I've yet seen. I've alluded to it in my previous videos. It involves a principle called Theodical Individualism, and the basic idea is that with the soul-making theodicy, under which God permits the beating, rape, and murder of the little girl in order to perpetuate a world in which humans have the opportunity for character growth, the little girl is being exploited. She's being treated as a means to an end, not as an end in herself. Even if we grant that some people connected with the murder of the girl will experience some character growth, this does the girl no good. This kind of divine exploitation was regarded as acceptable some decades ago. But it's now widely accepted that, in the words of Eleanor Stump, if a good God allows evil, by which she means apparently gratuitous suffering, it can only be because the evil in question produces a net benefit for the sufferer and one that God could not produce without the suffering. This brings us, naturally, to the Afterlife Theodicy. This theodicy calls for a change in perspective. It states that heavenly bliss in the afterlife, for all people for all eternity, will render all evils, such as E1 and E2, negligible. It will have been as though one element was removed from an infinite set. When looking at the infinity as a whole, the evil that did occur during the earthly existence simply doesn't count. And so, because the little girl, and we must presume the fawn, will experience this infinite bliss, by bringing this about, God is morally justified in permitting as much suffering as he wants on earth, because it simply doesn't matter. One obvious answer to the Afterlife Theodicy is that it presumes universalism, the doctrine that everyone will ultimately be saved and be able to enjoy this eternal bliss. This doctrine is, well, controversial at best in the Christian community. From my own observations, it seems that the majority of evangelicals fall into the exclusivist category. They believe that only those select few who meet the requirements for salvation will be saved, and the rest will be consigned to eternal hellfire or, according to some more fashionable modes of thought, either some kind of nebulously defined cold emptiness or outright annihilation. Exclusivists, therefore, cannot appeal to the afterlife defense. They might point out that if one is not worthy of salvation, then the evil that they endured during life is nothing that they don't deserve. This leads quite naturally to the Punishment Theodicy, which I'll consider in a moment. Another objection to the Afterlife Theodicy is that when we consider that God would have the power to bring about states of affairs that bestow eternal bliss, surely he would have the power to bring about such states of affairs that are unmarred by earthly evils such as E1 and E2. Regardless of how long the afterlife lasts, regardless of how insignificant the earthly evils are by comparison, it seems that it still would have been better if E1 and E2 had not occurred, certainly for the fawn and the girl. Some Christians have suggested that the girl's memories of her earthly agony would be obliterated, either by the passage into heaven or by the sheer passage of time. But as Theodore Drange points out, personal identity could no longer be preserved if one's most significant earthly memories were to become dim to the point of extinction, quoting John Hick at the end. You find this kind of identity association in, for instance, Holocaust survivors. The agony that they have suffered becomes a core part of their identity. By obliterating the memory of that agony, the person who is saved is a different person than the one who lived on earth. So since God would be capable of bringing about a heavenly afterlife without E1 and E2 having taken place, it's difficult to see how creating a blissful afterlife, even for everyone, morally justifies God in permitting E1 and E2. Turning now to the Punishment Theodicy, the view that E1 and E2 are meant as punishment for man's earthly sin, the answer is obvious. How did the fawn sin? What grievous offense did the 5-year-old girl commit that she deserved what happened to her? The only way the Christian can respond is by appealing to original sin, vis-a-vis the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and so forth. I don't think I can do better here than by again quoting John Hick. The time has long been with us when Christians can not only see, but must frankly say, that the Genesis story is not history, but myth. For the past century, evidence has been available concerning the earlier states of mankind before the brief span of recorded history, and none of this evidence lends any support to the theory that the human race is descended from a single original pair, or that mortality and liability to disease and disaster are other than natural to the human animal in his place within the larger system of nature. I would say that anyone who disagrees with this assessment, given the widespread nature and the sheer volume of the evidence of the type Hick mentions, is, and I'm going to be blunt here, so far out of touch with reality that they cannot possibly pose a serious threat to the argument from evil. My wife and I name our guinea pigs after characters from the Star Trek canon. This is Una. She's been with us for a few weeks now, and she's our #1 piggy. She has absolutely nothing to do with the argument from evil or any theodicy, but it's been about, 80-85 minutes of viewing time since I last had any guinea pig content on my channel, and that's just unacceptable, so here you go. You're welcome. The Natural Laws Theodicy, defended by Christians such as Bruce Reichenbach, states that God is permitted in allowing evils such as E1 and E2 for the sake of allowing a world governed by natural law. Reichenbach argues that a world in which God constantly intervened with miracles to prevent evils would be a world of unpredictability, where humans would not learn the lessons of cause and effect and therefore could not make proper moral choices. However, as Michael Martin pointed out, a world in which miracles were constantly taking place would not necessarily be devoid of regularities. Aside from the laws of nature that operate fully well without causing evils, and therefore without causing God to intervene, God can intervene in human affairs according to a regular pattern, which humans could learn. For instance, anyone who attempted to rape another person would invariably find themselves teleported to the nearest convenient jail cell. And even if he chose not to intervene according to regular patterns, he could certainly make it clear to humans what his intentions will be if they make certain decisions, thereby enabling them to make rational decisions. Moreover, even if a world in which God constantly intervened was not a viable option for an omnipotent being, he could still create a world governed by natural laws that did not by themselves produce evil, as they would never, again by themselves, cause human and animal suffering. Reichenbach considers this possibility and responds by stating that natural laws as we know them could not function in this way. If events sometimes follow a regular pattern and sometimes not, for example, if dry wood in an open field is sometimes combustible and sometimes not, then there can be no natural laws regarding combustibility. However, in such a world, there would still be some sort of regularity that governs when such materials would and would not be combustible, and these would allow humans to discern cause and effect and thereby make rational decisions. So the natural laws theodicy fails. Some pop apologetics argue that evil is needed for the purposes of contrast with good. Just as we learn what hot is by contrasting it with cold, or what light is by contrasting it with darkness, so we know what good is by contrasting it with evil. The problem with this one is obvious. Even if the awareness of evil was necessary for contrast purposes, it does not follow that the actual experience of evil is necessary. We need not have knowledge from experience of what evil is, merely empathic awareness. God could easily have created humans with such awareness. And even if this weren't possible for some reason, God could still have permitted less evil than he did. Surely E1 and E2 in particular were not necessary for contrast purposes. So this theodicy fails. Some have argued that this world is the best of all possible worlds, that any other logically possible world that God could create would necessarily contain more evil and/or less good than our own. Aside from the various arguments from both atheists and Christians that the notion of a best possible world is incoherent, I dare anyone watching this video to tell me that this world is really a better world than a world where, all else being equal, E1 didn't happen. Finally, one theodicy, popularized by Rabbi Harold Kushner in Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, postulates that God is not able to prevent evil. He's simply not omnipotent and doesn't have that power. The problems with this theodicy should be obvious. First, it falls outside the conceptual framework of evangelical Christianity. Few Christians indeed would acknowledge a God who is not omnipotent. Second, it is incoherent to suppose that a being is able to create a universe, is able to create natural laws, is able to create life, but is unable to prevent E1 and E2. That simply makes no sense. To summarize, We have seen that none of the theodicies we have considered managed to provide a state of affairs that, by his bringing it about, would justify God in permitting E1 and E2. We have, I believe, provided more than enough reason to believe that premise P of the argument from evil is true. This is the first major step in defending the argument from evil. But there remains the school of thought known as skeptical theism, which attacks the argument from evil on the basis that we are not permitted to infer the existence of pointless evil and suffering from the existence of apparently pointless evil and suffering. In other words, it attacks the inference from P to Q. This will be the topic of the next video in the series. If you enjoyed this video and want to help my channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to share your thoughts on the argument from evil or any of the theodicies we've discussed, leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.